Welcome to the Leaders in Diversity and Inclusion Speaker Series. I'm Jill Finlayson, and I'm the director of the Women in Tech Initiative at the University of California. And we're trying to promote the participation, persistence, and advancement of women in STEM fields. And a lot of that comes down to how do we create equitable workplaces? How do we create diversity and inclusion practices that make everyone feel like they belong in the workplace. So I'm very excited to co-host this event with Ramu Nagapan, who's the Assistant Dean of the UC Berkeley Extension. Ramu, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jill, and welcome everyone. Those of you on the West Coast, good morning. And I know we have people from all over the country and the world joining us today, so thanks a lot. As Jill mentioned, I'm one of the assistant deans at Berkeley Global and UC Berkeley Extension. We are the continuing education and professional education division of the university. We've been around for almost 130 years. And one of the important parts of our mission is a community-facing aspect, really promoting public dialogue and getting great series like this off the ground to connect with people all around the world. So I'm very excited about today's conversation.
Thanks so much. And that is one of the things I'm most pleased with kind of partnering with Berkeley Global on this, is really thinking about these issues from a global perspective and really bringing this innovative series to you. So this is the second in our series, and I'm super excited to introduce you today to Bo Young Lee. She is a globally recognized diversity and inclusion and human capital executive with more than 19 years of experience, both internally as a leader in tech companies and other types of companies, and as a dynamic consultant. She really tries to embed diversity and inclusion transformation into the organization, enabling it to become an engine for innovation and new business. This sort of integrated approach, I think, is super important and core to how we change people, business, operation functions, and balance change management in the needs of communication, education, collaboration. So she is now the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Uber, a global and complex company with staff, drivers, riders. So welcome, Bo. Can you tell us a little bit about your career journey and how you came to this work?
Great. Thank you so much, Jill and Ramu. I'm so happy to be here and happy to tell you a little bit about how I ended up here. I oftentimes get a lot of questions from individuals about how did I find myself 19 years into a journey where I'm the leading diversity, equity, and inclusion in one of the most hottest companies, notorious companies, the ones that have been in the news the most about D&I. And I wish I could say that I had planned it all along and I was some kind of genius for anticipating that D&I would be like the biggest growth field in corporate America. There was no such journey or no such, ability to read the future. Really, for me, I think it stems from a couple of things. One, I grew up in a household where I was raised by a refugee and an orphan. My mother's an orphan. My father was a refugee during the Korean War. He's North Korean by background. And so my family always, and we're immigrants as well. We came to the United States when I was a young child. And so we always had in my family an ethic around humanitarianism and social justice. And my father, my mother, even though they were immigrants, my father in particular was deeply invested in understanding the history of the U.S. And he spoke very early on about, slavery, how that shaped the country, the civil rights, the feminist movement. My parents were very pro-LGBTQ in the late 70s and early 90s, 80s, when it wasn't something that you found in most Americans, let alone immigrant Americans. So I always grew up with a very progressive value system. But I'd actually gone to university as an undergraduate thinking that I would get a PhD in behavioral economics. That's actually what I did. And I even got to the point where I had applied to and gotten accepted into a PhD program for economics at MIT. But like most young people when they're 20 years old, you suddenly have a freak out moment. You're like, oh my God, I don't want to spend the next 6 years of my life. That's my whole life in school. So I did what I always tell people, the smart thing, and I decided to back out of the program and instead got a job, that most people do when they're young and smart, but they have no idea what they're doing with their life. I went and became a management consultant. And I did that for many years and still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went back and got my MBA. And it was during my MBA that I really had this epiphany. It wasn't necessarily to go into the field of corporate diversity and inclusion, but I was a very odd bird in the MBA field. First and foremost, MBAs tend to attract people who are politically, socially, fiscally more conservative. It was a very masculine environment. NYU at Stern at the time was about 23% female in the MBA class. It was very low representation of people of color. And I stuck out like a sore thumb. And I always had this realization in my classes that nothing I was really learning in my MBA programs was really applicable to me as a young female person of color immigrant who had a really funny name, because a lot of the leadership models that were being taught to me in business school were ones shaped and formed for and by white heteronormative middle-aged men. And so I started asking the question, how does someone like me be successful in a corporate role? And that really led me to get very curious about, like, what does it mean for a woman? What does it mean for a person of color? And so I did the dumbest / smartest thing. After getting my MBA, I decided to join a nonprofit called Catalyst, which is one of the oldest think tanks focused on women in business. And I did that for multiple years. And, back then, back in 2001, that sort of time frame, no one really cared. Well, I shouldn't say no one, but very few companies cared. Like the chief diversity officer role was almost non-existent at the time. And I just assumed that I would spend my entire career working in the corner of a nonprofit, like trying to pay off my MBA debt. And it just so happened that I think those questions I was asking myself during my MBA, how does someone like me thrive in a corporate workplace? The realization is that there are more people that look like me, women, people of color, immigrants, people from other nationalities, who are going to struggle. And so just over the course of the last 2 decades, as my own career grew within corporate diversity and inclusion, more people like me started finding a voice and saying, I want to be successful. And so we're now here 20 years, approximately 20 years hence, really seeing the collective power of people who had formerly really been voiceless. And the women were always there in the workplace. They just didn't have as strong of a voice. The people of color were always there as well. They didn't have a voice, and now they do. And companies are really starting to confront that. And I have never experienced a year like 2020 in my entire 20-year history of focusing on this work.
Just one follow-on question, since you were at Catalyst, and I'm obviously interested in women in tech, what did you learn at Catalyst that really stood out from you, that sort of informed your journey?
Yes. So one of the biggest lessons I learned at Catalyst, well, 2 things I learned. First and foremost, you have to be research and data oriented in how you approach the corporate diversity and inclusion space. And I think this is a really big lesson. There has been such an influx of people coming into the diversity, equity, and inclusion space wanting to drive and lead. And they come from a very activist, like social justice activist minded approach. And one of the things that I keep trying to tell people is, like, the social justice activist model of change is very fundamentally different from the corporate advocacy oriented approach to social change. And that's why a lot of relatively newer DEI professionals tend to fail in their roles. And a lot of corporations also fail in their roles because they're fundamentally taking a change management model that doesn't fit and trying to fit it into a corporate setting. And the thing that I learned at Catalyst, one, is root everything in research and data. Catalyst actually took a chance in hiring me. I was the very first MBA they hired, because predominantly because it is a think tank. They hired PhDs at IO Psych. They hired a lot of people with academic backgrounds to bring that quantitative and qualitative, rigorous approach to the way that they researched women in business. And it was the best training ground for me, because I then learned that qualitative and quantitative approach, and I've brought it into everything else that I've done. The other side of it is that you have to understand the corporate change management model. It's, you have to understand influencing, you have to understand communications, you have to understand all the different components that make an organization thrive. And fundamentally, you have to have that business background. And that's where my MBA really comes into play. And I've run P&Ls in the past as well. I don't have a traditional HR background. And so I can speak the language. It's like, they look like a duck, quack like a duck, it's like I can look and sound like the MBA but I never forget the root of what I'm trying to draw, what kind of social justice and equity I'm trying to change. And so I merged the two, and people have, my finance professor at Stern, he said, you're a unique person because you both can, you can do math and you can talk to people at the same time. That's a very unique combination to be able to do both very well. And so I always take I can talk the language of business in the quantitative way, but I always bring that social justice element. I merge them together.
So, Bo, organizational change and change management is definitely going to be one of the key themes we'll be talking about today. And you've touched on it in a great way so far. You've worked both in tech and non-tech companies. And so what have you observed as some of the similarities and differences there, especially as you think about change?
Sure. Fundamentally, the challenges as well as the opportunities of diversity, equity, and inclusion are pretty consistent regardless of what organization you're working across, because I've always maintained that organizations struggle with diversity and inclusion because society it struggles with it. If society didn't struggle with it, if we lived in this like kumbaya world where everybody got along, that would also translate into our organizations. We struggle with it because people learn really, like, the thing people have to understand is like the attitudes we have about gender or race or immigrants or different religious religious backgrounds or different gender orientations. Those are values that we actually learn fairly early on in our life. We don't like to admit it, but by the time you're 7, 8, 9, a lot of our attitudes about gender, race are already formulated. And so we have these attitudes and we bring those attitudes into our work environment. So every organization is constantly getting this inflow of varying different views about gender equity, race equity, disability equity, and accessibility, and so forth. And the thing that makes each organization unique is though you're all receiving, the same people more or less, it really depends whether or not you end up having huge issues with harassment, bias, non-inclusion has to do with the culture that you've cultivated. Have you cultivated a culture that appeals to people's like enlightened self-interest to be inclusive? Or have you cultivated an organizational culture that triggers self-protective bias that then exacerbates things like the latent racism or sexism or homophobia or ableism that people have? And you can do one or the other. So fundamentally, the issues, the driving forces behind diversity, equity, and inclusion across companies is very similar. I think what really is different about the tech industry, and Uber is my first tech org. I've been in financial services, performance management, consumer product good, manufacturing. The big difference that I notice about tech, there's a couple of different things. One, first and foremost, I think tech has done a better job, and this is going to sound really weird, tech has done a better job of creating this high stakes world that somewhat, and this is going to sound a bit harsh, somewhat exploits the natural inherent anxiety that exists within high performing individuals and exacerbates it to get higher performance. But that fundamentally also then exacerbates the anxiety and the mental health challenges that can exist as a byproduct of it. And when you create an environment like that, that is kind of playing on people's competitiveness and people's anxiety to please and perform and be productive, you trigger people's self-protective bias. And so there's so much written about how tech has this outsized diversity, equity, and inclusion problem. And I don't think it's outsized so much as it's a byproduct of that anxiety and the self-protective bias that bubbles up. And so I've actually seen like really stable, good people coming into an organization, and then they suddenly get like really worried and they start engaging in behavior that is like not exactly who they are. You kind of have to go snap out of it. Like, don't let this industry, don't let, this organization, don't let this city get to you. And they're like, oh yes, right, my core, who am I? What am I doing? So I think that's one thing that I've noticed that's unique about tech, and the reason why we have such diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges here. I think the second thing that I sometimes notice about tech, which is unique, and the reason why DEI is such a fundamental topic here, as opposed to some other organizations. One is, two things. One, tech tends to attract a fairly privileged workforce, meaning if you are a programmer, you're an engineer of some kind, you've had to have access to all of those resources, many, many years of education to get to that place. You've had to have been introduced to computing and all that stuff relatively early on. And yes, there are people who are self-made, but or didn't grow up in that background, but they're the anomaly, they're not the norm. And so you have people who come from a relatively large amount of privilege, whether it's socioeconomic or otherwise, and they simply don't appreciate the diversity that's out there, or even appreciate how much privilege that comes, thus making it harder for them to have the empathy to think about the diversity that's out there. I think the second thing that is also the reason why DEI is such a core responsibility within tech is because in modern history, there have been very few things that has literally transformed the way that we live our lives, the way the products that tech creates has. If you think about what Uber does, right? We're only 10 years old as a company. People are, and we've fundamentally changed how cities move, how people move, right? If you think about I have an iPhone here, you can't really see it, but like I have an iPhone here, like the iPhone, I know it wasn't created for this, but it is like a working mother's best friend. Like I have 2 young children, 9 and 3. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be a working mother of young children without my phone. Everything is done on my phone, right? Everything is done on my phone. Ordering groceries, scheduling dental appointments, trying to match my husband's calendar with my children's calendar and their after school. It changes the way that we live our life. Tech has changed the way that we live our life. And so if the product doesn't fit the needs of the diverse world, that exacerbates inequality. And it's like the simplest example I can give you is I wear an Apple Watch most of the time. I hate the fact that it can't figure out when I'm pushing a stroller. I've literally taken my Apple Watch and wrapped it around my ankle so that I can get my steps in, because it can't friggin' get like the push of a stroller. And I've given that feedback to every Apple designer I can think of. I'm like, just make it catch my stroller walk, Now my kid's a little older than that, but it was like the biggest annoyance in my life. And so that's why DEI is so different within the tech industry, because whether we build that equity into our products can either achieve greater equity or can exacerbate that equity in our daily lived lives.
So if this is, the data shows, right? The data shows that diverse teams creates better innovation that works for everyone. It creates better decision. It creates better profitability. Why is that data not enough? Why is appealing to people's moral sense of, inclusion and everybody having a fair play, a fair opportunity? Why is that not enough to change the situation in tech companies and companies broadly?
Yeah, of course, because that moral appeal isn't as immediately satisfying as doing things that are self-protective. There's really interesting research. So a researcher, a professor at Columbia Business School, particularly Kathleen Phillips, she did some amazing work. She unfortunately passed away last year, but one of her really great groundbreaking pieces of work that I reference quite a bit when I do some introductory work in DEI is that she found what she calls the diversity and inclusion paradox, meaning she did a bunch of research with heteronormative and heterogeneous and homogeneous teams. And she had them complete tasks, these heterogeneous and homogeneous teams complete tasks. And then she had the teams rate themselves on a couple of different metrics. One, first and foremost, she asked them to rate their confidence in the quality of their overall outcomes. And then she asked them to self-rate the quality of their teamwork and their ability to work together. And then she had objective measures of like how well the outcomes, like how accurate and how good the quality of the outcomes were. The interesting thing is that consistently the heterogeneous teams, the diverse teams, had better outcomes, more accurate outcomes, higher quality outcomes overall. But interestingly enough, when you look at the self-rating, the homogeneous teams rated their outcomes as higher, meaning that they felt more confident in the quality of their outcomes than the heterogeneous. The heterogeneous teams were a little bit more mixed about the quality. And more importantly, the homogeneous teams, the non-diverse teams, were way more confident about the efficiency and effectiveness of their process, while the heterogeneous teams were very critical about the process they went through. So think about that. The diverse teams had better outcomes objectively, but the non-diverse teams thought they had the better outcome and they thought their process was better. And this is where the dilemma, this is why she calls it like the paradox of this, right? We can appeal to people and say, there's so much objective data that shows causal link between diversity and performance, diversity and better outcomes, diversity, better creativity, higher profitability, dozens of studies. But when your lived experience with a diverse team is one where it's harder, you feel less confident about it, and it just kind of sucks more all around. Humans are fundamentally emotional people, right? And in order to understand like economics, you have to understand the psychology. And so humans are always going to the reason why phones work so well is because it gives us that short-term like burst of, satisfaction, when we get that ping that someone liked a tweet or something. It's the same thing when you're in a diverse team. It's a non-diverse team. It's very satisfying because you're constantly being self-validated by the people around you. And you'll choose that and create rationale for why that is better over a team that challenges you, but gives you a better outcome at the end. And so part of what I actually tell people all the time is anticipate that when you hire diversity, you're going to have to go through a much longer extended period of storming. And your instinct is going to always scapegoat the person that is most different. But we all go through this. And that's the only way we're going to get to the other side where we actually get the benefit of diverse teams.
So how do you move the giant ship then?
Right. It's hard. I mean, and that's the other thing I think is there has been, because tech is one where innovation like seemingly happens overnight, change happens overnight, people anticipate that they can D&I overnight and somehow change everything. But if there's one lesson that I've learned in diversity and inclusion, because we're working with such difficult things, if it was easy to change on diversity and inclusion, wouldn't we have found somebody somewhere who would have done it easily? The companies that have made the most progress, if you really look at what they do, they've been on these journeys for 20 years. So righting the ship is a slow process. And it's a process that literally, like, sometimes, like, I tell Uber, I'm like, they're like, oh, we made 1 percentage point improvement from last year. And I'm like, do you know how hard I worked for that 1%? Like, don't poo-poo my 1%. Like, give me some credit for that 1%. It's one where I have to constantly remind the organization, like, 1% is actually good, as long as we can sustain it, as long as we don't lose ground, right? And people have read we have a diversity report that we publish every single year, and we actually lost about 1.7% on our underrepresented people of color, so Black, Latinx, and others. And we did that largely because of all of our layoffs that took place this year and some unanticipated changes that we had to make. And I felt gutted because that 1.7% literally took us probably 3 years to get that. So how do you right the ship is one, you have to care for much longer than you anticipate. You have to push harder. And I always tell people, change in D&I isn't because we haven't figured out the right solutions or there hasn't been enough innovation. There has been plenty of innovation and it'll continue. But change is hard because you have to continue with those systems changes year after year after year after year, far longer than you have to anticipate. Uber achieved pay equity for the first time in 2017, and we've maintained it organically for 3 years now, so through 2020. If I listed out every little process change we had to make to ensure that pay equity was a constant for 3 years organically, it starts everywhere from like the moment we start recruiting a person to making them an offer. Then we have to look at their development over time. Then we have to look at promotions. Then we have to make sure our performance management system is perfectly like as equitable as possible. There are dozens of things that we have. It's not like we can just like do a pay equity analysis every year and that's it. It's like we have to move so many small pieces all at the same time, moving in the same direction. And that's why my team is not large at Uber. I have a team of about 12 people. for a company of over 20,000 individuals. And people say, how do you get this work done with such a small team? And I say, I don't do the bulk of the work. My team doesn't do the bulk of the work. We just coach. We basically create accountability. We create the infrastructure to support DEI, but then we put the accountability to actually do the work in the people who own it. We make sure comp is doing what they have to do. Talent acquisition is doing the things that they have to do. The engineering managers are doing the development they have to do. And we hold all the leaders accountable. So we have like 20,000 people trying to work to create equity, but it's an infrastructure that we've built to support that.
It's interesting what you say about accountability, Bo. How do you, I guess you'd say, where do you encounter resistance and what do you do about that?
So luckily for me, I have not encountered that much resistance within Uber itself. And that's part of the reason why I've joined the organization. A lot of people, when I joined Uber in early 2018, I joined almost a year after the Susan Fowler blog was, the infamous Susan Fowler blog. It was a year after the infamous Delete Uber campaign was launched. And a lot of people asked me, why would I had a really comfortable job, in the insurance industry at the time. And a lot of people asked me, why would I take the D&I job that no one wanted to take? That was probably like the chief diversity officer role at Uber. And I said, because when is it the safest time to fly? It's right after a plane crashes, because they're making sure every other airline is making sure everything is okay. It's sort of the same thing. Like, I knew that the work at Uber would be hard and the scale of change at Uber would be hard, but I fundamentally knew that I would not hit that much resistance. At least I wouldn't hit conscious resistance. And so luckily for me, I haven't hit that much conscious resistance, where the unconscious resistance really comes up. And I think this is particularly true for the tech industry more than others, is that I think the tech industry buys into the mythology of meritocracy a little bit more than any other industry does. I think science as a whole, right? My husband is a physician scientist, and I think, the National Science Foundation, they all talk about this quite a bit as well, how much sexism and racism there is in the science field. But I think the STEM fields in particular believe that truly, because they've internalized ideas, science is objective, math is objective, engineering is objective, it's all objective. We have these very hard criteria for what is good and not good, as opposed to liberal arts and English and all the humanities and stuff. They say we can tell when something is good objectively with quantitative data. And so therefore meritocracy definitely exists in our industry. And so the people who make it to the top are the ones who are the best at what they do objectively. So there's a broader belief, it's amazing how much people believe in the meritocracy that exists within STEM. And so the resistance really comes from people. As much as you say there's inequity, even if people won't articulate it, part of their mind is no, I'm here at the top because I'm the best, I'm the smartest, I'm the most everything, not recognizing how much of the system is designed to validate whatever it is that they are, right? And I think that's where the resistance lies, particularly within STEM, particularly within tech. I don't think that, 50% of all medical school, more than 50% of all medical school students are female, and it's been that way for over a decade. Yet, if you look at leadership in hospitals and medical schools, I think I read somewhere saying that there were more Johns leading men with the first name John leading a medical school than there were females leading medical schools. Some ridiculous thing like that, and I'm pretty sure that's true. If truly there was meritocracy, close to 50% of hospital and medical school leadership would be female by this point, because it's been almost 2 decades. No, it's been almost 3 decades, because women started hitting parity in the early 1980s. And it's just not the case. And it's not because the men are somehow suddenly smarter once they graduate from medical school. It's simply that, we've created an infrastructure in the sciences, in the medical field, that validate male norms and supports it, right? So that's what we find in the tech industry as well. There's just this belief in meritocracy.
Yeah, I think building on that, we started to look at, like you're saying, gender balance, and then we started to look at racial balance, and then we started looking at intersectionality, right? And so how do you see, D&I, DEI across companies dealing with the more complexity, I guess, of identity?
Yeah. The thing about intersectionality is fundamentally, it is, we tend to now talk about it, which is, Kimberly Crenshaw at UCLA Law School, she was the one who really articulated the theories of intersectionality, and which is an extension of like critical race theory. And what she really wanted to do, and the base, I always give a little mini intro to intersectionality, because that mini intro then helps to understand how you address it. It stems from the legal field, because what they were trying to prove, and what Kimberly Crenshaw was really trying to do, is to say, in order to understand the inequity in the criminal justice system, you have to understand the oppression that comes from being having multiple aspects of an identity, right? So what is the oppression of being a Black person? Okay, we need to take that into consideration when we consider what is justice legally. Then you have to take the oppression of being a female, and then you have to take the oppression of being like, so it's a study in like understanding oppression and struggle, right? And so, and it's really important to realize that it is an identity, yes, but it is more so a study of oppression and obstacles. Because then you have to, because it directly translates to what you do in an organization. If you only approach intersectionality as an identity, then you could get away with saying, all these disparate programs that we have for developing women or developing people of color, as long as you have something for each group, you're okay, right? But having something for just each group, independent of everything else, doesn't actually address the unique experience of that Black female, or that Black female with a disability, or that, Indigenous person who grew up socioeconomically poor, right? Because their lived experience isn't just isolated to being, okay, I can come here to this program and I'll talk about how to navigate as a woman. And then I'll come to this other disparate program that is meant for people of color, and I can learn about navigating. Because you might, in fact, in some ways, some of the advice you hear for women and for people of color actually run into each other, right? And they contradict each other. So you have to take the experience of both and anticipate. And what I've actually done, one of the things that I'm driving at Uber, is I have a metric, and it's probably my most important metric. And it's like what I call like Black women thriving. And I said, that's my single most important metric, because if our Black women, I just assume that if our Black women are thriving, meaning they're being hired, they're being promoted, they're getting developmental opportunities, their attrition is going down, everything else is better, because we know as a society, I mean, that Black women are probably the most put upon, the most oppressed, large group. Like, you can triangulate that further and say, okay, transgender Black women are the most, you can say that, but like as a measurable cohort, Black women. And I measure it that way. And then the second thing you have to do is then you have to build strategy around that lived experience of oppression for Black women and the obstacles that they face. And I just assume that if I create a solution that works for them, it will by default help everybody else. Just in the same way that sidewalk cutouts for people in wheelchairs helps everyone else, like working parents who are pushing carts, delivery people who are pushing big packages. Designing for the least privileged in our society helps everyone else fundamentally. And I think that's how companies have to start thinking, as opposed to simply thinking of it as an identity, but like a study of like lived experience with oppression.
One thing I'm curious about, the very term intersectionality can feel very loaded to some people. And so many of these issues in DEI are politically charged. How do you diffuse that charge as you talk to people and build a coalition around these issues?
That's a really good question, because people do assume that DEI is for the politically progressive, and it's not for anybody else, right? It's for those who don't have power, who want power, and not for anyone else. I lead with a lot of empathy in the way that I work, and I like to always make sure that people understand the definition of diversity. And one of the reasons why I don't call people diverse people or diverse candidates or anything like that is because diversity isn't an identity. A diversity is a fundamental state of being that exists when two or more people are together. And it's the exploration of where we're different and where we're similar. And I always lead with a model that I learned very early on in my career. One of my mentors came up with this, and he always said, it's all about you, it's all about me, it's all about them, it's all about us. We oftentimes, when we are approaching DEI, we talk about like the other. You know, I need to understand the person who is different from me. And we don't spend a lot of time exploring like who I am and what I bring to the table. And so I always, you know, and I'll tell you an anecdote that will help explain what my point of view is. I'm very direct and candid, as you can tell, and I'm very transparent. I'm also very cheeky, and I have very little respect for authority. Like, I just like talk to people. I don't care who they are, what their title is. Like, I'll joke with you. It's one of my adaptations as an Asian woman to try to build bonds, because a lot of people don't realize that they have no intimate relationships with Asian women in any context of their life, and they certainly have no experience working with an Asian female in a position of authority. You know, so I really try to close the gap, because a lot of people don't have relationships with Asian women. So a few years ago, I was 41. I was massively pregnant with my second child, and one of our presidents in my last company, in my insurance company, he tries to be a really good champion for diversity and inclusion. And he's a white man in his 50s, blonde hair, grew up in, actually was born, he's of English descent, was born, I think, in like Nigeria, and then like, anyway, and then went to boarding school and all that kind of good stuff. So he comes up to me, so comes from a very privileged background. He comes up to me one day and we're having a conversation, and he goes, you know, Bo, I want to be a better champion, but I don't consider myself a very diverse person. So like, I'm sitting across from him, and I was a bit young, you know, 41 at the time. And I go, get out of town. You're also a 41-year-old pregnant, first generation Korean American immigrant lady. And he just looks at me going, what the hell is wrong with you, Bo? And he's like really giving me this quizzical look for about like a good 5 seconds. He just didn't get what I said. And then it suddenly dawned on him. He's like, and I said to, and then I sort of followed up. I said, here's the thing. You are a diverse person. You are as weird and strange to me and as I am weird and strange to you. I don't know what it's like to be a 50-something-year-old white guy with blonde hair who was born in Nigeria and then went to boarding school in England. Like, I don't know anything about what that reality is like. And that's weird, you know? And I said, you don't know what it's like to be a 41-year-old pregnant lady, you know, immigrant with a weird, funny name like mine. But here's the thing. I said, the reason why you don't think of yourself as diverse and I do is because the entire world is designed to validate you, everything about you. So you just see representation of yourself over and over again in places of power and, you know, product and all this stuff. And I don't. So this idea of me being diverse is like normal for me and internalized for me, but it's not for you. But I said, trust me, if I started a company with a bunch of middle-aged Korean women, you'd feel so out of place and you'd feel so awkward, and you probably could not perform to your highest ability. And so it got into, and then it led to like a series of coaching with him where I started to explore what are the lessons that he learned through his life that shapes the way that what he thinks is good and high performance. Like, that's what it led to. Like, what are the things that led him to there? And how can that differ for other people? And I got him to a place where he no longer saw himself as normative, that he saw himself as a deviation of everyone else's normative. And that was like an epiphany for him. And he changed as a leader fundamentally from that. It took a lot of coaching, but we got there. And I think one of the things around transformation is to get people to start to realize what is it that what has shaped what they believe to be normative? And then can they challenge that and realize that not everyone else has that same normative view of what is good. But these are the conversations that we're not, and this is what I meant early on about like taking a social justice approach to equity, an activist approach to a more corporate, you know, IO psych based approach to change. Is you have to lead with like this very like individually rooted approach that led with a lot of empathy. And I think one of the big challenges that we actually find on the social justice side, on the activist side, is that there isn't as much empathy for people who are on a journey to try to understand than I would like to see. And I can get into a lot of trouble sometimes when I say that, but it is my true belief.
Well, that's actually related to a couple of questions that Ryan Kosek asked in the chat. He said, does Uber use allyship in its DEI efforts? If so, how? And how are you holding leaders accountable?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do absolutely 100% use allyship. We actually use multiple forms of allyship and championship. So we have things like sponsors, champions, allies, partners. You know, we have different roles for people depending on the level of drive that they're taking on. So like a sponsor is someone who's like usually in a leadership role of with some power, and they're actively advocating either for an individual to rise through the organization or for a group. We have executive sponsors for our employee resource groups, for example. We have champions who are simply individuals who bring the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion into the day-to-day job. So if you're a product manager, what does inclusive design look like? That's what a champion would do. And an ally is someone who simply leverages their voice to drive the voice of another community. And I'll show you, even within historically marginalized groups, you can still be an ally for another group. So I'll show you, I'm going to switch my background for a very important reason here. Back in June, or late May, June, you know that June is Pride Month, and our Pride group is extremely well respected within Uber. We oftentimes do a huge amount of programming in Pride. And of course, at the end of May, early June this year, we had the George Floyd murder lynching happening. And our Pride group was like, we can't go forward with our original programming, not with what happened within the Black, to George Floyd and within the Black community. We have to stand in allyship. So they, in like 3 days, transformed their entire Pride program to support our Black community. And this is one part of that allyship. We have all these like Zoom backgrounds to support various different months and campaigns that we have going on. And for the month of June, this became our background. Our Pride group fully handed over their Pride platform to the Black community, and we explored actually Black Pride and what that meant. And it was a way for them to support George Floyd. So that's one of the ways that we use allyship, but we use allyship. We say it's allyship both for people in power to support those who have less of a voice, but it's also those who are in different communities. The Pride community can absolutely support the Black community. Black community can absolutely support the women. Women can absolutely support everyone, because actually in the grand scheme of things, women of all our different ERG populations are probably some of the more privileged because women have whiteness in them, right? So they get the privilege of that racial element. So how can they be allies? So we've been able to exploit it, but this is just one example of many that we have. I'll just leave this background up now.
So, as you were talking about allyship, you mentioned Pride Month and Black Lives Matter. Both of those things probably have complicated resonances outside the United States. So given the fact that Uber is such an enormous global company, how does this work happen outside the US, the context in which we're most familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. I think the global nature of the way that we've approached diversity, equity, and inclusion is one of the things that I'm very proud of. The function of diversity, equity, and inclusion did begin as a North American function. It was a byproduct, it was a direct byproduct of the civil rights movement and the establishment of like the EEOC. And the earliest form of DEI began as affirmative action planning for federal contractors. So that was like in the 60s and 70s. And it's evolved since then. And so sometimes nowadays, you hear in the global sphere, people saying, the way we approach DEI is too North American centric. And I agree with that criticism, but I want people to understand why it's so North American centric, because for the first 30 years of this work the early 90s, 2000s, it was all US based. There was no DEI anywhere else around the world. And one of the hardest things about addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion around the world, first and foremost, is there's highly variable levels of understanding of what this topic actually is. And even so, and I've had this experience in many countries, you go into a country, and I do a lot of keynotes around the world globally, and I love the experience when I'm giving a keynote in English, because that's my most fluent language, and I'll hear the translator in one of my ears, and they'll be speaking, they'll be translating live, like real time, same time, my speech, and they'll be like speaking in local language. And then the second I say the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, they pause. And then they say diversity, equity, and inclusion in English. And then they go back to like whatever the language they're translating into, because many languages don't have the words diversity, equity, inclusion, or even a rough translation of them. So they use the English language because these concepts that we think are universal, this concept of like diversity being a good thing, inclusion being a good thing, equity being a good thing, you can't assume that they are in every country. So sometimes you're even, when you're going into certain countries, I've done a lot of work in Latin America as well as in Asia in particular. You can't assume in most places in Asia that they actually believe that equity is actually a social value that we should all uphold to, right? It's only been in recent history that, for example, in India, that they've outlawed the concept of castes, though we know that though they've outlawed it, it's still something that drives all of like social hierarchy within India. How do you have a discussion about driving diversity, equity, and inclusion in India when a society has been built around inequity, unequal distribution of resources? It's a very different conversation. So what Uber has done, first and foremost, we have local D&I leaders all over the world who can localize what we do and anticipate. But at this, and one of the other things that we've really done that I'm very proud of is early on, in order for us to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion, we had to have a better understanding of what the global workforce looked like. So I set out on a 9-month-long journey to roll out what I believe to be one of the largest corporate global self-ID efforts. So we have an 8-question self-ID. It's everything from gender, race, ethnicity, gender orientation, sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability status, parental, caregiver status, and a few others. There's 8 categories. And we ask that question in every country that we operate in, so 67 plus countries. And in only places where we don't ask certain questions is if there's a legal barrier. So for example, in France, we can't ask about race or nationality or ethnicity, simply illegal. So we don't do that there. We don't ask about sexual orientation in those countries, particularly in the Middle East, where it's illegal and would potentially bring harm to somebody if data was breached in any way. But we have this very robust set of global data now, so we at least know who's there. And then we have our local individuals, so they really customize our approach globally to what is important. In India, for example, we have a huge focus on socioeconomic, which we don't have quite everywhere else, but we also have that in LATAM as well, because Latin America. And then the other thing is we do have some core principles as a company, and we try to push aggressively certain things like, for example, pride and LGBTQ inclusion in countries where it is not illegal, but it is socially very taboo. So for example, we have actually recently been named as a gold level employer of choice for LGBTQ in India, which is really significant. We just got that this year for the first time. And then last June, when we were running our Pride campaign, we always run a huge Pride campaign. We have a lot of material, a lot of branded stuff. All of our television screens are rebranded to Pride. We really wanted to push it. So we pushed our Pride screen and materials to every country where it wasn't illegal. So not in like Russia, not in Saudi or anything like that. But the question came up, should we run our Pride campaign in Pakistan? Which, as you know, is a Muslim country, and therefore sexual orientation is a very taboo topic. And we were like, we checked the local laws, and nothing was stopping us from people weren't going to anticipate our screens as propaganda, illegal propaganda. So we ran our Pride screens in Pakistan, and we got so much positive feedback from the workforce in Pakistan, going within our like green light hubs and stuff, going, oh my God, I feel so validated. I feel so included. This is amazing. Uber's doing this. The only negative that we got from our Pride campaign in Pakistan was actually when some clients came in, some like business corp dev folks came in, and they saw our screens. They were outsiders coming into our office, and they were absolutely offended by our screens. And that led to a whole conversation. Should we take them down in Pakistan? Could the outsiders? And we ultimately decided to keep them up in Pakistan anyway. because this was corporate. We kind of used like, this is global corporate campaign, we can't take it down. But it was our way of driving social change, in a place where we felt it was just safe enough to do it. So we do take an activist stand sometimes, but we do so thoughtfully.
How does this play out in the drivers and riders side of the equation? Because if somebody's not picked up for, unfortunate reasons, what do you do?
We actually have, we know that, so in our community guidelines, we have very strict policies about non-discrimination, both for our drivers, but also for our riders as well. And we hold people accountable to that. But we know that, our driver partners are independent contractors, and they may, and we've had instances where a driver partner, like same-sex couple, will be in the backseat of a car and they start kissing, very, innocently, and they get kicked out of an Uber, right? We've had a few instances like that, or we've had an instance where actually in one of our regions, we had a large number of service dog denials for people with disabilities, in part because that community where this service denial was happening, we happen to have a lot of driver partners who are of Muslim faith, and the Muslim religion has a very unique relationship with dogs and animals and pets as a whole. And there was just a lot of service denials because these Muslim drivers didn't want to have dogs in their car. And so first and foremost, we do have these very strict community guidelines that prohibit any kind of discrimination or service denial based on like a protected class. But we know that there are situations, we investigate every situation that happens, and we, if we find that there's a clear violation of our policies, we do take action. And drivers, we have banned multiple drivers, as well as customers, I should say, because customers also engage in not the greatest behavior. So we have banned people, but we also try to, as I said, like we try to take an empathetic approach to things, right? So I'll use the service dog denial example. When we discovered that the reason why we were having such a high level of service dog denial was because of this religious, this like kind of religious orientation and view on dogs, we didn't ban like every single Muslim driver in that community or anything along those lines. We actually took an educational approach with them to really help them, remind them about their responsibilities to be compliant with the Americans with Disability Act, because as an independent contractor, they're responsible for that compliance. We did a lot of in-app push notifications to remind them about of what it means when they deny a service to a disabled person with a service animal. And we were able to, within a few weeks, a few months, we were able to cut service denial complaints by half in that community for service animals. So again, what we really try to do is we have the rules, we have the policies, we have a very thorough investigation process, but we also try to use education as a mechanism, and just-in-time education, to really remind people and appeal to that higher sense that sometimes you have to appeal to.
Thanks. So with our time left, maybe we'll turn to some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. So we have one here. How does Uber use data to implement and assess inclusion initiatives? And how do you use this data to ultimately show, quote unquote, culture change?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways. So, and data, you have the quantitative data, and I guess that's when usually people say data, they mean the quantitative data. There's qualitative data as well, of course. So we use both kinds, qualitative and quantitative. As I mentioned, I was supposed to get my PhD in economics and I didn't, so I'm naturally oriented. I love data. I love the, what can be, the stories that can be shown through data. So we have two sets of data within Uber. The first and foremost is what I call the lagging metrics. So like the representation data, just pure representation data, representation by multiple different cuts and levels. We do hiring, promotion and attrition, and we track that continuously and constantly. And actually that was one of the really big things we built is early on, we built a full D&I dashboard, scoreboard that we have now cascaded down to all of our Director Plus. So anybody who's a director or above can actually go in anytime and get real-time data on how they're doing and see the trends going up and down. We don't just show pure data, we show trending, are you going up or down? That's all lagging metrics, because lagging metrics can't only tell you how successful you've been. It can't actually predict how successful you will be. We actually just recently went through a huge exercise where we did a bunch of regression modeling to determine what the causal factors for success are at Uber. And we have built some leading metrics around that to see if we can anticipate, like what are the things that cause success, and can we then push more representation into those causal areas. Like, for example, we know people managers tend to have a accelerated promotion rate, and that's Uber. I'm not saying people managers overall, but at Uber, people managers tend to have an accelerated career path, and you can become a people manager relatively early in your career, like 3 to 4 years, you could become a manager. We have been trying to use that metric, how many people of color, how many women are in people manager roles, as a predictive metric. So we've done that. And then we do quite a bit of qualitative data gathering through focus groups, through exit interviews, what we call stay interviews as well, what makes people want to stay here. We summarize those and provide them. We do pulse surveys. And all of this is driven around, I love what Daniel Kahneman said, data has never changed someone's mind. We use data as a mechanism to show people where we are, but then we use a form of narrative storytelling to then paint the full picture, to get people to appeal not only to people's brains, but like to the emotional side that actually drives behavior.
I'd like to switch gears and go to Christina Hall. She asks, hi, Bo, you mentioned along your career journey that you have made a pivot in your early 20s. Do you have any advice for others looking to make a pivot in their career?
The only advice I can give you, because this is my own personal journey, is you just have to make the change and not know what's going to come around the corner. When I decided not to get my PhD, I backed out of my the program I had gotten accepted to at MIT without knowing what I was going to do. And I was like freaking out. I was like, shit, but I just knew I had to back out of it. I knew academia was not the right path for me. When I decided that I was going to go work for a nonprofit, I had no idea how I was going to get there. As I mentioned, I had a job, so it was 2000, if you can think about it, it was 2003. It was still right after the first tech bubble burst. Only half of my MBA class had gotten a job offer. So people there weren't many jobs available. I'd actually gotten a job offer from the company I interned in the summer before, and I decided to turn them down because it was a corporation, and I really wanted to work at Catalyst. And Catalyst, as I said, only hired PhDs at the time. I think I harassed them for about a year. I did a different job for about a year. I harassed them for about a year until I think I just wore them down and they hired me. And I didn't know how I was going to work at Catalyst, but I was determined to do it. So the only advice I can give you, and it worked for me, I don't know if it worked for anybody else, is if you really know what you want or what you don't want, just make the change and have faith in yourself. I think women in particular tend to feel like they have to have everything in place. There's that research that shows that women feel like they have to comply with 90% of all job descriptions in order to apply to them, and men are like, I meet half the criteria here, I'll apply to the job. I think a lot of women, when they're making career changes, feel like they have to have everything in place. They have to have the right educational background to make the pivot. They have to have the right connections. And I would just say, take a little bit, be willing to take a slightly bigger risk than you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, just sort of a follow-on for that. A lot of women expect if they do a really good job in their career, they'll get promoted, but they aren't necessarily getting that without asking, or they're not getting the stretch assignment. Do you have any advice for that situation for both managers and for the employee?
Yeah, if you have a female person on your team and you're a manager, whether you're male or female, always make sure you're asking them about once every 6 months, but even maybe more frequently, what do you want out of your career? Just ask that simple question, and that question may trigger, and just keep asking it, even if they say they're happy with what they're doing right now. If you ask it enough times, they'll eventually tell you what they want, and use that information to help guide their careers. That's one piece of advice. I do that with all of my team all the time, so that's one. If you're a female, first every time you're having a performance review conversation with one of your managers, always ask the question, anyone should do this, but is there something that I'm not doing that you would like to see from me right now? There's something that I can develop. Even if we're all A+ students, there's always something that your manager will always have something that they want to see from you. And if they tell you that they there's nothing. Then say to them, is there something, if I was the next level up, that I don't currently have? There's different ways you can ask the question to get something, right? Because the other part of it is that it's been, research has shown that managers are, including female managers are much more likely to give genericized, non-specific feedback to women and people of color, and give more descriptive and detailed critical feedback to men, because they, especially like if you have an opposite gender or a different race manager, they don't want to be accused of being sexist or racist or all the kind of good stuff. So they generalize it, but they hold you accountable for the critical feedback they have in their head. They don't communicate to you. So you have to figure out a way to get that critical, detailed feedback. And then, you know, one thing that I always say is like, even if you don't know what your long-term goals are, like know what you want your next project or assignment to be, and make sure your manager knows that, right? And make sure your manager, let's say you are a product manager, right? And you've never worked on, you've never worked directly with the engineering team, and like you've always worked like a step away from eng. In order to, for any product manager to, for their career to move forward, they have to be able to speak with engineers directly. So if you're like a beginning product manager and you've never had that opportunity, say, I would like for my next assignment to be able to like work directly and have an ownership with an engineering partnership. Like I want to talk to the engineer, so I'd learn to build that skill set. Just let them know what you want, and that'll really help move your career forward. And if you think you're ready for a promotion, tell your manager. The manager can say, no, I don't think you are. And then your manager says, no, I don't think you are. Don't get upset. Say, okay, what do you need to see from me then for me to get promoted? Like, don't be upset when your manager tells you something that's different from your own self-perception. Use it as an opportunity to grow and develop. Eventually, over time, if your manager keeps saying you're not ready, then you know that there's gender playing into it. But the first time, take it at face value and say, what can I do to get that? You know, get that next thing. Don't be defensiveness when you're getting feedback is like literally like the career killer. It's the career killer. It'll just stop you in your tracks.
All right. So another question here. I think you've touched on this already, but I'll throw it out there and you can answer further, or we can move on. So how do you translate DEI from headquarters to the Uber drivers, or two different populations? So how do you sort of manage that messaging out to those populations?
Yeah, I think that we are just starting our journey with really developing our relationship with our driver partners, in part because we have always, like, I asked this question, like the first day I joined Uber, before I actually joined Uber, I said, what's my role in helping us build our relationship with driver partners? And I was told point blank, we have to keep an arm's distance from them because of the patchwork nature of the laws that define what is an independent contractor. People don't realize that every state, and sometimes every municipality in every state, has a different set of laws about how to define and treat an independent contractor and what defines them. If you look at what we did in California with Prop 22, and we now have what we're calling an Independent Contractor Plus, part of the reason why we were driving that is because we actually feel as a company that we can offer a lot more to our driver partners. But we felt constricted to be able to do that because of laws that say you can't do anything to maintain that. But now with Prop 22, we're able to offer benefits, we're able to offer time off, we're able to do things without threatening their status as an independent contractor. So I think this equity for our driver partners and for our couriers, it's just something that we're just starting to explore what that looks like. And I'm really looking forward to diving in with our teams, our product teams, our operations teams, to see what that looks like further.
So the next question is really around, operationalizing these practices. And the person here is asking, I kind of more broadly, like, what is your advice for changing hiring and doing these incremental process? This person, Alicia Moody, wants to know, do you think the educational piece is realistic when handling DEI issues in a smaller company? I love that approach, but I'm thinking about employees having to come in contact with each other because of a smaller company size, and it may not feel like the company has taken a strong enough stance. So kind of two spectrums. You're at this very large company, there's small companies. What's your advice?
So small companies, yeah. In a way, being in a small company is easier, but it also can be harder because the relationships are much more intimate, right? and everything becomes more personal, therefore. So how is it easier, right? It is really hard to do things, execute consistently across 60 countries and 20,000+ employees. And the larger you are, like, scaling things is really hard. But it's easy from a way, it's easier because you can create a mandate and then just roll it out. And there's a little bit of an anonymity that goes into being in a larger company. I think smaller companies, like, if you really want to drive change, you can do it very easily. You're not having to deal with thousands of people. You have, like, hundreds of people. And, if a leader wants to make a change, they can make a change. But the problem is, first and foremost, you have a lot more intimacy. And so therefore, you're not just dealing with, like, the issues of, like, gender, race, ethnicity, but you're dealing with interpersonal as well, right? And then the second thing is, in all companies, the leader really matters, but in a small company, a leader really, really matters. And if you're trying to drive DEI and the leader in a small company doesn't fundamentally believe in it, you are pretty much not going to make any progress. And I know that's a very negative thing to say, and a pessimistic thing to say, but truly the leader matters. Especially in a small company, because they drive everything. They drive the culture, they drive the behavioral norms, they drive what is perceived as good. It has to start at the top, as someone put in the chat. And if the leader of a small company doesn't believe in it, short of there being a huge lawsuit, like, I don't know that you can drive it very hard. And people of color, women, people who are marginalized, who are in a small organization, really have to question, like, is this the right place for me? Like, I'm not someone who tells people, I live by the stance that no one has to ever participate in their own dehumanization. And if a small company is not the right place for you, like, it's okay to leave. Like, I've left jobs 2 months after starting them because I realized this is not right for me. I've made those mistakes in my career. It's okay. It's okay. Like, literally 2 months in, I was like, shit, this is not right for me. And I left a relatively large company. So, if you're in a small organization, you're trying to drive DEI, work with the leader, start with the leader. Really, you can't drive it's really hard to drive grassroots when a leader is not quite there yet.
All right. I know there are a couple more questions coming in, but we're almost out of time. So, Bo, I'll just invite you. Any last words, any advice for people in this field or organizations who are wrestling with all of these issues as 2020 closes?
Yeah. For the individuals who are navigating your careers, I will invoke the words of the notorious RBJ, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I give this advice to all women, all people of color. Her story goes like this. She asked her future mother-in-law, everyone knows she has this kind of not a fairy tale, but she has this, like, very idealistic relationship with her husband, who was the most supportive champion for RBJ. And her husband's parents had a very long, successful marriage too. So she asked her mother-in-law on her wedding day, or right before her wedding, she asked her mother-in-law, can you give me some advice for having a happy marriage? And her mother-in-law's advice was, it often helps to be a little deaf. And RBJ told that story when she was asked for some career advice during one of her speeches. A woman asked her, like, what's some career advice you can give me? And she told this story. And I find that when you're somebody who comes from a background and an identity that's more marginalized, you're going to hear a lot of stuff along the way. I've heard everything. And I think one of the things that gives me a lot of resiliency and the ability to do this work for as long as I have and climb as high as I have is my ability to be deaf sometimes. I don't listen to all the criticism. I don't listen to all the terrible things people say about DEI professionals, and I'm focused on, like, the end prize, right? So that's my advice for individuals. Like, don't ignore all of it. Don't be deaf to everything. You do choose, you do battle, but pick your battles wisely is, I think, kind of what RBG was saying. RBG was saying. For companies that are doing this work, I would say, get yourself a really good DEI professional who knows how to talk data, one. The research from Harvard actually shows that the single biggest factor that drives transformation is having somebody who's accountable for the work. of all other things that you could do. 2, get someone who actually can speak the data and can speak the language. Companies, and I'm going to be super transparent here, there's a lot of hiring right now. And companies are doing, as companies are hiring right now, they're doing a lot of value signaling in how they hire. They're hiring for optics over experience. Hire yourself a good DEI professional, not just based on what you want to signal to the marketplace, because you're going to find yourself frustrated and you're actually going to do yourself more harm if you hire the wrong person.
Thank you so much. It's really been an amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed your candor and your tips for companies, because these changes are really important, and I appreciate your commitment to the long haul as well.
Oh, sorry, you cut out there just a little bit. I think it's my internet. So
just wanted to thank you for being in it for the long haul and giving people the advice and tips to start the journey. Ramu, let me hand it to you to do the wrap up.
Well, you may have frozen, but I just wanted to also add my thanks, and thank you, Jill, for being a partner in this endeavor, in this series. Well, it was such a great conversation with you, really engaging. You raised so many amazing questions for us to continue to ponder, and gave us some really practical and useful insights into what you're wrestling with over at Uber. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it so much. Really great conversation, both of you. Thank you, Ramu and Jill.
Thanks. And thanks to the organizers of Berkeley Global, everyone who made this event happen. And thanks to everyone who attended today. You have a wonderful holiday season, and we will see you in January for our next talk.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.